في ليلة من الليال لست أدري ما تراني ظلمة تغمرني
الأرض ضاقت والسماء وقلبي ما عرف الضياء والدمع بات يبكي يا إلهي يا إلهي يا إلهي يا إلهي يا إلهي.
At this time, I would like for us to kind of formulate questions that we have as we will enter this period of dialogue and conversation. However, I would like to first invite, this is going to be a surprise, first invite the presenters to see if you have any questions for each other.
Yes. I was enormously interested by your presentation, which it seemed to be so sound. But your optimistic note raised in my mind, and perhaps in the minds of others, the question of whether the emerging transformation of those jihadists is in fact the transformation which one has seen in the Muslim Brotherhood represented by Morsi and others. Is that the sign of the positive transformation that we may hope for?
Mm-hmm. I need the microphone. Okay, well, actually, it's the story of the Muslim Brotherhood and Morsi is something that I still have difficulty trying to make sense of. Maybe because the condition they were in, which was so unique, meaning for the first time in their history, they actually took power, something that has not happened to the other radical groups. And by taking power, I think they failed miserably for different reasons. And I would say that they are to be blamed for some of what they have done, but also, definitely, history will blame also other elements, such as the deep state in Egypt and so on. And I think that they have proven when they took power that they have not really internalized those changes to a point where they can actually run a state. And that was their biggest failure. And that's what is actually giving mass support to the current government in Egypt. I know many people may disagree with the coup and with Sisi and everything. But no matter what you say, if you are an objective observer and go to Egypt today, you're going to find that Sisi has massive support in his country. And this is something not to be denied. Now, that doesn't mean you agree with him or you think he's good, but it is a reality. And why he got that support is because the Muslim Brotherhood proved that by taking over a state, they don't know how to run it as a state, they still want to run it as a sectarian group that believes, as you said correctly, on that we have the ultimate truth, and everyone else has to be like us or become a second-class citizen. And this is where they fail. Now, for the radical groups who have transformed, they did not have that opportunity to actually take power, so I really cannot judge them on the same level. But I am optimistic by the signs I am seeing from some of the leaders of Islamic Jihad who transformed themselves. Some of them, by the way, today are celebrities in Egypt, and they are on TV all the time, advocating peace in the name of Islam. It is amazing to see those are the very same people who masterminded the killing of Sadat and trying to overthrow the government in the name of Islam. And now they are going around talking about how to peacefully and non-violently address the grievances. So I would say that this is the glimpse of hope that I am holding on to, and I hope that it will grow.
Any more questions for each other as presenters?
Okay. I mean, I really appreciated so much the degree of self-criticism for what happened, especially during the time of the Crusades, and taking it all the way into what you mentioned happening in the Great Lakes area and in southern Sudan. That's still people who are holding to Christianity but still killing each other. I also noticed that no matter how far you went into this, you always came back to the fight between Islam and Christianity. And I was hoping to hear a little bit more about what do you think can be done about the Christian fighting, like what's happening in southern Sudan, like what happened, as you said, with the Hutus and the Tutsis. What would be, I mean, if God forbid this happens again in anywhere in the world, not including an Islamic element, what would be a good advice to deal with it?
It's obviously enormously difficult to say what would put an end to the tribal violence in Africa. I'm told by people who know South Sudan a lot better than I certainly do, that one of the problems is the confessionalization of the tribes. And I'm not sure whether I'll get this right, but the Dinka are Presbyterian and the Nuer are Episcopalian. It's the other way around.
Yes.
But in any case, and the Catholics also have a tribal base. As long as we, as Christians, don't speak adequately to each other about what is common in our understanding of our faith, it's not surprising that subgroups, tribes, clans who espouse Christianity, but in a particular confessional framework, will use those differences to justify the violence against each other. So I think that the challenge for Christians, and I mentioned what I really regard as the year of hope, 2017, that we will actually take some time to step back from the 500 years of fighting among ourselves, some of which extremely bloody, particularly in the first 100 years after the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, as different secular powers sought to impose their understanding of Christianity. That we have a lot to do, and we have an opportunity to do it, because if we don't, then I think there will be those Christians who will opt for non-peaceful resolution of current international problems, and will say that violence is justified, that the end of putting a stop to ISIL or whatever it is justifies the use of violence. And I guess I'm increasingly skeptical. I'm going to go way out on a limb here. I'm increasingly skeptical about the whole just war tradition in Christianity, which has made it possible for us to justify all kinds of violence about which I'm not entirely happy, looking back in my own lifetime before.
Thank you. I would like to invite questions. You may address your question to one of the speakers or to both of the speakers. Yes, please.
Dr. Abdallah, you've talked about how the individual members of the early rebellion against some of the people in the Middle East, the ones that you inquired about earlier. Is there also a role for the mosques themselves throughout Islam to try to carry a message to reorient a lot of the violence and to try to create a more peaceful situation? Is there a role for the mosques in this?
Okay, a question about the role of mosques and religious leaders today in the Middle East about addressing more militant factors within their faith.
Absolutely. I mean, of course, those religious leaders in the mosques, they have in their hand, I mean, just like in Christianity, you have the Sunday sermon. In the Muslim world, you have the Friday sermon, which is a moment when the religious leader or the imam has the ability to reach a wider audience. But that's not the only method they reach people. I mean, they have also their different lessons and lectures during the week. The mosques have been, of course, a big factor in depending on, because mosques in Islam are not similar, say, to a Catholic church where there is a control and hierarchy, or the Shiite sects of Islam. No, that's in the majority of the Sunni Muslim world, mosques, if not controlled by the state, they are really anyone's grab. And as such, it depends on who is there giving the sermon and who is preaching. Sometimes they are violent, sometimes they are spreading a message of hatred. And it is sad to see that sometimes I have seen across the Muslim world, they do this spreading the message of hatred out of just acting like parrots. They are just repeating things that they've inherited generation after generation without understanding what they say. I give you an example. I went one time to Bangladesh, and I was praying, doing the Friday prayer there. And according to some of the to some schools of thought, that the sermon should be done in Arabic, no matter what. Even if you are in a country that doesn't speak Arabic, well, too bad. You speak still in Arabic, and it's their responsibility to understand. And so I remember that there was at least part of the sermon. So I remember that imam who was giving the sermon, he was speaking mostly in Arabic, most of the time. So as such, I mean, most of the people didn't understand what he was saying, but I could understand. To my shock, at the end of his sermon, we have kind of a ritual, certain thing that they repeat and say. And they just have been doing this for generations and centuries, sometimes without even revising anything. So he started to use those words like, may God destroy all the Hindus, all the Jews, all the Christians. I mean, he just was praying for God to destroy anything that is not Muslim. And people were just behind him, not knowing what he's saying, are saying, Amen, Amen, Amen. And it becomes like such a ritual that they are repeating. But what scared me is, so when he does a circle with young people, is he saying the same thing to them? That is one example. But then I've seen also other very positive examples of people spreading beautiful messages. Whether in Egypt, whether in Bangladesh or other places. So it's really, and I think that I found that the state really has to play a role. And I know that may sound like not democratic, not giving people freedom, but there is no escape from the state has to take control and to make sure that the mosques do not be a place for breeding violence and terrorism, and to also keep a vigilant, watchful eye. And that doesn't have to be happening by the state. I think the civil society, the citizens themselves, should play a role of being neighborhood watch, even in the mosque, and to keep an eye. And because sometimes, by the way, it's not the imams who are spreading the message of violence. We have also seen a tendency that young people start to meet together in the mosque, and they start to discuss together. And then they come up with the conclusion that, you know, the society is infidel, the government is infidel, and all the Western countries are infidel, and our job is to fight them back. And they know that if they say this publicly, that they will be criticized by the leadership of the mosque. So they start to form their own small secret group inside the mosque. Or they move on to their small little mosque that they develop somewhere else in their neighborhood. All those dynamics are becoming so serious all over the Muslim world. And who can protect against them? You cannot have the state running after everybody. But it is the neighbors, the people who live there, should be aware and be vigilant about what is happening, and to find a way to address those issues in an early warning method, not to wait until things escalate and get out of control.
Thank you, Dr. Abdallah. Another question for our speakers. Yes.
This is for both of you. Could you speak a little bit about a context for a dialogue around forgiveness? I'm sorry to admit that I don't have a good understanding of the Islamic sense of what's required for forgiveness.
Okay.
But in terms of whether it's truth and reconciliation or like how when we do critical reflection of history, that while we're not responsible for it, we are the inheritors of all the grief and nonsense from it. How can we move forward, or at least how can we have a sense of a future? And I ask it from a selfish context as well as a global context. There are some committees already beginning of Christians around how we are going to acknowledge / celebrate / mark the Reformation in a way that is not in a way that it doesn't in a way that's honest about both the gifts and challenges of the whole experience. And so when we speak of the Crusades and others, I mean, what's some of the context for forgiveness?
So context for process of forgiveness.
What's that?
Alphonse and Gaston are not sure about the answer to this.
Microphone.
No.
Microphone.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It seems to me that forgiveness in this context, religious forgiveness, has to be based on an honest understanding of the violence that has been committed in our respective names. That is, you can't have, it isn't just a unilateral process in which one side or the other acknowledges wrongdoing. There's plenty to acknowledge. But if there's going to be forgiveness, I think it requires reciprocity at some level. Now, how to get to that level when it's easy on one side or the other, but speaking as a Christian, it's easy to find justification for much of the violence done in our name against groups, individuals, and so forth, whom we perceived to be evil in a variety of different ways. So getting to that admission of vulnerability and responsibility for the wrongs committed in our name is the first step, but it requires some mutual recognition of the same kinds of problems. They're obviously not the same with our interlocutors. And how to get to that dialogue, I think, is quite difficult given our mutual ignorance. I can only speak for Christians. We know very little about Islam, very, very little. And until we know more, we are not even in a position to engage in that dialogue which would lead to reconciliation and forgiveness.
I would say that on the Islamic side, yes, we are still struggling with trying to understand the notion of forgiveness. And I would say that this is not because of lack of text or sources about forgiveness in our religion. Actually, they exist. They are right there in the Quran, in the practice of the Prophet. But here I would be critical about the doctrine that has developed over generations and centuries. The doctrine that we have inherited is highly legalistic. And maybe I say this because I studied Islamic Sharia when I was in law school in Egypt. And so they trained me so well in how to think of everything legally. But the problem with the legal interpretation of the Quran and the Islamic sources or any religion to that effect is it only looks at the legal text. It doesn't look at other text that does not lend itself to be legalized. Let me give a concrete example. The Quran is full of verses that talk about, like, if somebody took something from you or somebody attacked you, it gives you a license to get retribution. And of course, it is very careful to say, get only the retribution that is comparable to what happened to you or against you. However, consistently, when you look at the Quran, you're going to find that after it gives the license for the retribution, it says, but if you forgive, if you are able to elevate yourself above this, it is better for you. And for me, that's a powerful statement. It doesn't say it's better for the other person who is now off the hook. No, it's actually saying that you, the person who is going to forgive, is going to be better for you. And I think a lot of literature now psychologically is talking about the power of forgiveness and how it helps the victim to heal and to get over what happened to them. We have not explored this enough. Why? Because it doesn't lend itself to be legalized. Because so you find that there is this whole area in the Quran about forgiveness, about treating people with kindness in the middle of conflict that is not explored. Why? Because it is seen as that's not legal, that's between you and your God. As such, mountains of books can fill up Washington, D.C., have been developed over the centuries about the legal elements. But about what forgiveness is and why the Quran insisted that it is better to forgive, consistently. It says you can get the retribution, but if you forgive, better for you. But little was done about what it means. Even though the Prophet Muhammad, peace upon him, after he was persecuted by his people in Mecca and he left, and finally, 10 years after he goes back, or 8 years, goes back victorious, and he occupies that same town that once persecuted him, killed his companions and everything. He brings everybody in and he says, what do you think I'm going to do to you? I mean, you could have done anything to them. And he said, you go, you are free to go. He just forgave everybody. Total amnesty to everyone at that moment. I mean, what an example that we have from the life of the Prophet, and nobody can contest it and say it's not true. And I think that The problem we have is we have not internalized those processes. We have not studied them carefully. We have not learned how to apply them in the 21st century. But if we want to be complete Muslims, we must embrace that element of our religion that, in my opinion, has been forgotten.
Thank you.
I want to take advantage of the chair for a moment. I was very much struck by the call for be aware of grievances in Islam. And I was very struck by your willingness, Dr. Quainton, to begin a process of accountability in some ways from the Christian side. And someone once said to me, Christians love to confess their sins to God or his representative. We just hate telling other people we're wrong. Is there a way that we can move towards a process of grievance and accountability while praying for forgiveness down the road, but working through that hard and difficult process first? And should this happen among experts, as it has done in ecumenical dialogue in the Christian church, or should it happen locally among communities?
I thought you were going to answer the question.
I don't know.
You want to go first? Okay. Yeah, I think the issue of grievances in the Muslim context is, I find that to be balanced, you cannot just dismiss the grievance and say to all those radicals, just learn to be peaceful, learn to go about things non-violently while they are being attacked and bombed by drones and whatever it is, and then we say collateral damage. I mean, no, I think that everyone has to take responsibility for what they are doing. And we need to take seriously their grievances. As a matter of fact, I mean, even when I look at the ISIL videos, I mean, you get to deconstruct carefully what they're saying. They keep saying that, look what happened to us, look what you're doing to us. So so we are now retaliating against you in the same way you are killing us. It is just the method is different. It's an aeroplane with a sophisticated bomb versus we are slaughtering somebody. It's terrible what they're doing, terrible, but I think we got to understand the message that they are sending us and to say that what is it that can actually help us to reduce the violence. It is not going to always be by saying to them, stop violence, you are criminal, you are butchers and so on, and then wait a minute, let's go destroy them all and then just kill other people and say, sorry, we didn't mean it. No, we got to take responsibility for it. I mean, there have been horror stories that we have seen since that war on terror and since we have seen with September 11 and before that. And it happening in Iraq and in Afghanistan, women raped, burned alive by soldiers. And I see I mean, I will talk about grievances. This is where also I think that, you know, even if the governments in both sides are unable to say, we did something wrong and we are accountable, maybe this is the role of the church and the role of the civil society, is to say, no, in our name, do not go and kill civilians. In our name, do not go and rape women and say it's okay. And I think there must be a role like this. And I think if this role is played, it can help the Muslims on the other side to have leverage with those radicals and to find common ground with each other. I think there is a big space where people of faith on both sides can work together and they can overcome a lot of those grievances. If, as you said, they are sincere and they are self-critical and they can acknowledge that I am doing something wrong, and the other side also recognizes I am doing something wrong. But you know, human nature is not easy for anyone to acknowledge this, but this is why we're here, I hope, and we can do more of this.
Let me add just one small theological note, if I dare. It seems to me we have to rediscover or rethink a theology of sin. That is, you can only be forgiven if you perceive you have done wrong. And I was raised in the tradition that not eating meat on Friday 5 times was going to get me into the clutches of the evil one. If that's what is sin, then we are in a different world. We're in a different universe of concern. And somehow getting Christians at the local level, I do think this is something that starts in our communities, in our individual faith communities, about what really is the great sin against our neighbor that we have committed individually, collectively, nationally, and so forth, has to be at the heart of that and persuading individuals that they are part of that sin and hence need some forgiveness and reconciliation, because that's where it takes you. But if one doesn't have that kind of understanding of what we are commanded to do in the name of our faith, and I think that may be true in the same case of many in Islam, that you can distort the message that you have received in such a way as to justify or ignore the violence committed, and we're talking about violence here, in our respective names. So I think more reflection, a very unpopular word. I don't think our society as a whole isn't all interested in talking about sin. And consequently our churches have lost an interest in sin. And that's a pity.
Thank you. Yes, please.
You both noted the theological and the historical justifications in both religions for using violence as the tool for conflict resolution. And I think that makes a lot of sense, but I'm also seeing that using violence to resolve conflict is also very rooted in a very traditional masculine gender identity that is shared in both religions and in many cultures throughout the world. And so noting that both Islam and Christianity have very historical and theological and structural, in those ways, have excluded women, what kind of hope can we have for this type of renewed theological reflection if it doesn't include a complete transformation of the understanding of gender, both in our religions and also broadly, politically and socially and culturally?
So the question being violence and religion being very gender scripted towards patriarchy, I take it, and that if how can we move forward unless women, their voices and involvement is taken more seriously? How can we move forward in peacemaking?
Can we start?
You get the hard one first.
All right. Okay. So, no, I agree fully. And I definitely, we have had historical problems within Islam, not the religion itself, but the interpretations. They have been highly patriarchal. They even they went as far as twisting some of the words in the Quran in order to support a notion of superiority of man over woman and subjugating women. I mean, actually, one example that I use, but I regret that the majority here don't speak Arabic, but for the very few here who speak Arabic will know that one, for example, verse in the Quran that we have, and it actually relates to a story from the Bible, the story of Joseph the prophet. You know the story of Joseph the prophet, right? That he was taken in slavery into slavery in Egypt, and he was working in a home, and there was this master and his wife. The wife is fascinated by Joseph, and she is seducing him, and he is trying to resist, and she goes after him, and when he resists, she accuses him of that he tried to seduce her, and she gets him in trouble. When the master investigates the situation, he discovered that actually the woman was the one who actually tried to get him in trouble. That story is in the Quran, by the way. And there's a very interesting statement that that husband says to his wife in the Quran when he discovered that she was the one who was seducing and she was lying to get Prophet Joseph in trouble. He says to her something like, definitely you are so vicious. You, the woman herself, definitely you are so vicious. And the Arabic for that is like he said to her, inna kaydakunna, you and the friends of hers who were plotting, inna kaydakunna azim. I mean, it just means that you are such vicious people. Now, what happened over time is that if you ask 99% of Muslims in the world who speak Arabic to recite that particular statement, they will recite it in a way that will sound like God said that all women are vicious. And instead of inna kaydakunna, they say inna kaydahunna. And it is just, I mean, I've tried this everywhere in the Arab world. And some of the people who attended my workshop a few months ago here in this place, and you know I did it, and it worked. And ironically, actually, The one who actually made that mistake was an imam himself. And it was, but what it alerts us to is that culturally we have even manipulated the words of God in order to subjugate women and to put them in a position that they are evil and bad. And you cannot dispute it. I mean, the beauty of that example I mentioned is, it is in your face. You cannot say, oh, it depends on how you mean it, or no. It is people make that mistake, and they think this is how Quran was written, and they think that that's how God spoke about women. And for me, this is just the tip of the iceberg. Because beyond that is a continuous process of keeping women subjugated and violently keeping them subjugated, even with all the changes that happened in societies. And I think it will all go back to how we interpret. And it's similar to the issue of forgiveness, and that it is undiscovered. I think we are just unable to discover the beauty in our religion, the love, the compassion, because we have been too busy looking at the legalistic elements of how much to pay somebody if you have a dispute, and what punishment to apply when somebody does something wrong. But we just left aside a lot of the beauty of our religion, including how to work together between men and women. There are beautiful verses in the Quran. Like there is a verse that's directly saying that men and women are awliya. It uses the word awliya ba'dahum liba'd, meaning that men and women are allies to each other. I mean, in the context of Arabia of that time, the word ally, the word awliya that was used in the Quran, is used when like two groups, the leaders of the two groups are signing an agreement to protect each other. God in the Quran is saying that men and women are that type. They are. How can somebody be subjugated if she is made to be equal to you and supportive of you? How can it be when Prophet Muhammad, when he received the message of revelation from Gabriel, the angel, first time, he was so scared. You can imagine he was sitting in a mountain, in a cave by himself at night, and meditating. And then something comes to him and say, read in the name of God, and so on. And he was so horrified. He runs back scared. To who? To his wife. He goes to his wife. He doesn't go to the powerful man or anything. He goes to his wife because it is the woman, his wife, who loved him, who would care for him. This is the message that we need to promote. This is the message that we need to go deeper to understand. And if we don't do that, I agree with you. We will continue to fall into this pattern of patriarchal, male-dominated violence. And this is not checked because many traditions and cultures that exist around religion seem to support it, and they try to manipulate religion, not only Islam, but many other religions, in order to enforce this kind of violence.
Well, that was extremely eloquent, and I certainly agree with all of that. And I come from a tradition where I would like to see the stained glass ceiling broken. But that's a different issue, if you will. The place of women in our society and in our churches and in our religious life certainly could do with considerable improvement and change. I think we have to be a little careful, however, assuming that this would diminish the natural propensity to violence, which leads to war and so forth. We have enough women leaders who have emerged, if not in the United States, in other parts of the world, to suggest they are just as capable of organizing their societies to violent purposes as the men who came before them. So one shouldn't make an equivalence here. That's not an argument in any way for not arguing for the integration of women more fully in our respective societies and religious organizations.
Okay, this is going to be difficult because I wasn't watching first. I'm going to start here, I think, and we'll come back.
Are short comments allowed?
Yes.
Short.
Yeah, short.
Yes.
One for each of you. In your case, Tony, I think that the questioner was talking not about women, but about masculine culture.
Oh, yeah.
And so these women who have become political leaders have operated within a masculine culture. And then for what you said, I would add one other thing. In dealing with people who, many of the radicals want to go back to what they perceive as the original Islam, the Salafi period. So for them, it's very important to point out that that original period of Islam is when women were most involved in the development of the religion, when 10% of the hadith were transmitted by women, when someone like Aisha, the Prophet's wife, was considered you know, a jurist. And so that's something that, because we all know that the role of women fell off with time. And for people who say, let's go back to the original way, it's important to emphasize that.
Absolutely.
Very good, thank you. Let's go, I think, back forward if we can. Let me begin here, if I may. Yes.
Ambassador Quain,
Can you stand, please?
You started by half seriously referring to communism as a religion, and then also later talked about those who believe that violence is the only reply to violence, also as a quasi-religion. And you had some, but you expressed some hope, if I summarize you correctly, that a secular gradualism would leading to a firm, consistent, uncompromising containment. At least you expressed some hope there, I thought. But I fear you don't go far enough, because even secularism, secular thought, if it is thinking about firm, consistent, uncompromising containment, is still buying into the logic that that control, that coercion, is the fundamental guarantor of our security.
Can you phrase your point as a question?
When push comes to shove. I'm trying to get there, sorry. Whereas in all of our traditions, I think, there is the idea that our only healing, our only salvation, is in our enemy's healing. It's not just a matter of forgiveness. It's a matter of mutually coming to a healed relationship. And can you speak to that? Can you speak to how do we leave a religion in which we have faith in coercion, and go to a religion where we have faith in our ability to heal our relationships?
Thank you. How do we move from a faith religion tied to coercion and move towards one that healing of relationships?
I don't know the answer. It's a very valid point and a very valid criticism of what I suggested, because I was really wanting to have it both ways, suggesting that secularism is the answer because it will erode conviction and hence the propensity to defend one's religious beliefs violently, on one hand, and the other more challenging question about if religion's influence completely erodes, as it has in some Western countries, or almost completely, in parts of the United States, you might argue, that the message, the healing message of our religions will have no power to change people's minds, hearts, and behavior. And maybe you can't have it both ways, and I hear that. Getting away from a culture of coercion is very difficult, because since I speak now putting on my diplomatic foreign policy hat, we want to bring about change in the world in a variety of ways. And we have certain instruments of power that enable us to try to do that. I was going to say to do that, but certainly to try to do that. Some of those coercive measures involve the direct use of violence, war, or something very much like it. And other means of coercion are less immediately violent in terms of the sacrifice of lives in achieving the objective. How governments will ever give, governments being instruments of coercion in all sorts of ways and at different levels, and you can argue about how much coercion you want your government to be empowered to do in domestically and internationally. But to suggest that coercion is going to disappear, even if we were all to take our religious faith seriously as we ought, I guess I'm not that idealistic.
In the back, and then we'll come forward. Yes.
Hi. Come from an evangelical background, specifically Southern Baptist, and I've always been very interested in the relationship between evangelicals and Muslims. You know, I've noticed that there's quite a strain of apocalyptic thinking in evangelical religion, And I was wondering if you could comment on whether or not apocalyptic thinking in both Islam and Christianity has any impact on violence.
So a question about apocalyptic thought and both faiths and its impact on violence.
Okay, I just want to make sure that I got the terminology right, because of course the word apocalyptic, I mean referring to like that we have to reach a level of like a total disaster or war that will destroy the world, something like that, right? You know what, I mean, I don't know, I mean, maybe there are other colleagues here who will know more about it in the Islamic context, but there are stories. I mean, I guess there are two levels to this. I mean, if you are talking about Judgment Day and that the world will come to an end, then yes, definitely the Islam has that notion. It's not necessarily, actually, but it's not necessarily going to be man-made. But this will be the plan of God himself, that the world will come to an end, destroyed, totally gone, and then people, everybody will show up to the Judgment Day, and everyone is assessed based on his good deed or her good deeds and bad deeds and so on. But I think that is a story that's different from when I hear the word apocalyptic. I understand more that like the Armageddon, like that kind of war that will be between two major forces, the good and the evil. And there are stories about Jesus will come back at the end of time and he will settle that war. Or some in the Shiite doctrine, it is the Mahdi or the hidden Imam will come back, and for the Jews, of course, it is Jesus will come finally. I mean, but it depending on who you're talking to, there is a story about this Armageddon and the war. But I don't see that there is anything about it in the Quran. I mean, I don't see the Quran at all mentioning that final war of evil and good. But definitely a lot of discussion about that was by God's plan, the way He created the universe, it will come to some form of an end that is so horrific, but it will be the end of the world as we know it, followed by the Judgment Day. I mean, that's the one that I see in the Quran. The others, I've seen a lot of stories developing, but I really don't know what their source is. Some people say the Prophet mentions those stories and so on, but I really am skeptical about their authenticity in Islam. Again, I may be wrong, but or somebody can prove to me that yes, they exist somewhere. But the Quran, for sure, which is the main source, doesn't talk at all about an Armageddon or anything like this.
Christians have the problem of the end times, the sense that there will be signs of the end, clearly, explicitly stated in the scriptures, and at some level, at least I think in some groups, the violence which we witness in our world today is seen as the end approaching, and that the rapture will take place and so forth. I'm not very happy with that understanding of what violence means for our ultimate salvation, but there is that tradition out there, at least, taking the words of the apocalypse and projecting them onto contemporary society and saying, well, the signs are here. In a funny way, violence then becomes good news, because the end time is when the second coming will take place and the possibility of final judgment will be there. So it's a fascinating concept.
Thank you. Let's see, I think Rich and then Sabrina questions. We have about 3 minutes. I'm hoping we'll get at least 2 more.
Moral Man, Immoral Society was Reinhold Niebuhr's title. It's easier for me to apologize to an individual or gain reconciliation over a direct hurt than to deal with long-running corporate structures of injustice that leave some people oppressed and others enjoying. But the face-to-face, if we're to make this a dialogue, I hope you'll call on Ed Martin, because Christians fighting Christians in South Sudan, you all have helped on that.
Okay. A lot of questions, but
inviting someone else into the dialogue.
2 different levels of engagement around the whole reconciliation process. And okay. we would love to hear about Sudan, perhaps over the reception. We can hear more. Yes.
I appreciate what you just shared, Dr. Jones, leading into my question and my concern, and I appreciate you two gentlemen for sharing today, because as you shared, one of the things that you talked about is the grievances and the concerns and the larger issues, and then you brought up in the Crusades, like the history of the Crusades and the violence that comes from Christianity. My larger concern is this, is when will we get to a point where we really critically self-examine the history of our religion in terms of Christianity, and look at the atrocities and the things that have happened as a result of it, as it relates to humanity. As it relates to, because I like the fact that you pointed out, you know, what is going to be done about the Christian violence, but what does that stem from? What was passed down to us in terms of the Christian tradition, and also as a person of color, to recognize the fact that a lot of the Christianity that people have come to love is a Christianity that didn't love us as a people, and in terms of people of color. So how can we really have that deep, rich discussion with another faith where we have yet to really wrestle with that in our own tradition? And so how do you speak to that?
So how can we engage with another faith about grievance and atrocities if we haven't done the work within our own faiths?
I don't know. I'm not sure we can. And I think there's a very deep cultural problem, at least in the United States. Not just in the sense of racial relations and that relationship to Christian churches, across the spectrum of Christian churches in the last 200 years. But what inhibits our ability to critically examine the past and acknowledge the wrongs, the sins, is that we aren't interested in the past. We are a country that makes explicit in its political rhetoric hope you can believe in. That is, the future counts, not the past. And we have embedded in the way we think about the world a disdain for history, a view that it really isn't important. I understand it is important, but that it's very hard to get people to talk about what happened before. And always the answer is, how can we move forward? And I think that's a deeply ingrained American cultural problem, which is not shared by the parts of the world, which are deeply imbued with their history and think in historical terms. And how do we get people to care about the reality of the American past in ways that would be relevant to our religious understanding of how we could go forward in the future? I don't know the answer to that, but we surely should try.
Can I have the microphone?
Yes.
It's our final remark.
No, this is really this is a very important point, which is the futuristic attitude that you will have here in the United States vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And I think definitely that is a big difference. I think that in the Muslim context, as I have seen, and also traditionally in many countries in Africa, Middle East, Asia, and so on, the attachment to the past is way stronger. And it is different. You are absolutely right about this. And I think that to answer your question, speaking about the Muslim context, absolutely we need to go back and revisit our history using methodologies of deconstruction and of, I would say specifically like critical discourse analysis, where we look at how power has been used and institutionalized to dominate and to make one group victorious over another and justify that and make it sound that it is okay. And I think that if we use such methodologies, again, that's not the legalistic stuff. We got to use social science-based methodologies in order to understand our history, and it will take a lot of courage to do this, because a lot of the romanticized stories that have been handed down to us over generations will have to be addressed critically, and I think a lot of ugliness will come out. And I have a feeling that this is the only way we will be able to heal as a Muslim community. Yes, we have our grievances against others, but I think that our true grievances. The serious one is about how we have looked at our history, how we have constructed our history, romanticized it to a point that we don't see anything wrong in it. Even when we know that there was civil war right after Prophet Muhammad died and people killed each other and so on, somehow it is mentioned as if it was okay. I mean, but there is no critical look at what really happened here and why are we still divided at Shia Sunni until today. And I think, and a lot of issues about women and gender and how we subjugated them, racism, slavery, you name it. I mean, we had our share of all this, and that has nothing to do with our Islam itself or with our religion, but it is our history that has been dictated and dominated by an empire that was not different from other empires. And we need to learn to recognize this and to critically address it. Only then I think we'll be ready to deal with the grievances that are happening from others.
I would like to thank Dr. Abdallah and Ambassador Quainton once again, and if you would join me in...
عصيت والذنب كبير وإني في حزني يسير مقيد بذنبي يا رب فهل أستحق يا إلهي العفو مجرما مقر بالذنوب يا إلهي يا إلهي يا إلهي يا إلهي يا إلهي